Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is Flight Lesson 6 in our VFR or Private Pilot Level Training series. Today we'll talk about flying an airport traffic pattern, which is good for getting in practice landings. We'll also introduce the touch and go. An airport or runway traffic pattern is a rectangular course flown around a runway by aircraft landing or taking off from an airport. It's used to manage the smooth flow of air traffic to the runways at an airport, particularly one that does not have a control tower. It gives aircraft a standard way to enter the flow of traffic at an airport. It can also be used by pilots to stay in the vicinity of an airport to practice landings. You'll often hear pilots say that they are staying in the pattern, or request that from the tower, as it's a way to get multiple landings in a short amount of time. Even in a relatively slow aircraft like the 152, a trip around the pattern at Pine Bluff clocks in at a little under 6 minutes, so you can easily log up to 10 landings in an hour by staying in the pattern. Standard patterns are flown with left turns, though many runways have non-standard right-hand patterns due to obstacles, avoidance of noise-sensitive areas, or other factors. Information on pattern direction can be found in the Airport Facility Directory. It can also be found on the Airport Information block on VFR navigational charts. You can also see the pattern direction on the segmented circle if the airport has one. Lack of information on pattern direction indicates patterns are standard, or left-hand patterns. There are 5 legs in a traffic pattern. The departure, or upwind leg, is the leg that occurs after takeoff and follows the runway's extended center line. The crosswind leg is the second leg, where you turn perpendicular to the runway's center line. You typically reach the traffic pattern altitude near the end of this leg. The downwind leg is the leg that flies parallel to the runway. You usually begin your descent at the end of this leg. The base leg is where you turn back towards the runway and again fly perpendicular to the center line. Final approach, or final, is the leg where you line up with the runway for landing. The altitude you fly in the pattern is referred to as traffic pattern altitude. It is typically 1,000 feet above field elevation for propeller aircraft, usually rounded to the nearest 100 feet, and 1,500 feet above field elevation for jet aircraft. Procedures can vary by airport, and the Airport Facility Directory will typically list traffic pattern altitudes for most airports in the U.S., particularly if they are non-standard. As you can see from the AFD listing in Pine Bluff, the traffic pattern altitude is 1,200 feet MSL, which is 994 feet above ground level. So let's talk through the procedures for flying the traffic pattern at Pine Bluff. Before we begin, this video assumes that you are already familiar with and proficient at normal takeoffs, level offs, and normal landings. If you are not familiar or comfortable with these maneuvers, make sure to watch VFR Flight Lessons 1 and 5 on this channel, as those lessons cover these maneuvers in depth and we won't be reviewing them in this lesson. I'll also say that though headings, altitudes, and landmarks will be different if you use a different airport, these procedures should work at any airport that has a normal traffic pattern. I'll also apologize for my airport graphic being sideways from the way it would be on a map or airport diagram. The graphics and procedures just fit on the screen better this way. Before we begin the maneuver, we'll want to accomplish the before takeoff checklist. Then we'll perform a normal takeoff from runway 18 in Pine Bluff. As we accelerate through 60 knots, we'll retract the flaps to 0 as normal, and we'll climb out at 70 knots of indicated airspeed, trimming as needed. At 500 feet AGL, or 700 feet on the altimeter, we'll turn our crosswind, which will be a heading of 090. In the crosswind leg, we want to perform a normal level off at traffic pattern altitude, or 1,200 feet on our altimeter, which is just shy of 1,000 feet above field elevation. Once we've leveled off, it's time to turn downwind, or turn left to a heading of 360 degrees. Once established in downwind, we want to accomplish a quick after takeoff checklist. We do want to leave our lights on while we're flying in the pattern, but we do want to verify that we got our flaps up. A good reference for downwind is the large industrial area to the north near the river. Your nose should be pretty much pointed right at the center of it on downwind. You can also look out your left window either by using the quick view left camera or by setting a fixed camera looking in that direction. The road with a slightly greenish color to it is a good reference point. If the runway is cutting through the top third of your wing strut and the road is cutting through the lower third, you should be positioned pretty well in the traffic pattern. This is probably a little wider than you'd want to fly the pattern in real life, but it works out pretty well in Flight Simulator. When you are abeam the approach end of the runway, or abeam the numbers, you want to start setting up for your approach. This is going to look very similar to the procedure we used for a normal straight-in landing in the last lesson. You want to apply your carb heat, reduce your power to 1900 RPMs, hold your altitude using pitch and allow the aircraft to slow, trimming as needed to maintain the pitch you need to hold your altitude. At 85 knots of indicated airspeed, you want to extend your flaps to 10 degrees. You want to pitch then to maintain 80 knots of indicated airspeed, and again trim as needed to maintain this pitch. And then you want to adjust your power so that you get about a 300 to 400 foot per minute descent rate. When you reach a point that is 45 degrees from the approach end of the runway, it's time to turn base. You can tell when you're at that point when the corner of the approach end of the runway is pointed at you. For landmarks, you can also use a road that runs east and west just south of a large grove of trees as a reference in Pine Bluff. Once you cross over this runway, it's time to turn base. It'll be a left turn to a heading of 270. Once you've completed your base turn, you want to extend your flaps to 20 degrees, pitch for 70 knots of indicated airspeed, trimming as needed, and adjust power to maintain your descent rate of about 300 to 400 feet per minute. You shouldn't need to adjust your power that much. 1900 RPM should give you a pretty good descent rate of about 300 to 400 feet per minute. Once established on base, you should be flying parallel to and north of the road you crossed when you made your base turn. You'll see a set of buildings with a large light-colored pavement area just to the south of the road and a small grove of trees just to the north of the road. To time your turn to final, you want to make your turn so that you fly just inside or east of this grove of trees next to the small industrial area. A slow turn of about 15 to 20 degrees of bank that keeps you just on the east side of these trees should line you up with the runway without having to move your camera all over the place checking for runway alignment in the turn. You should roll out on final at about 500 feet above the field or about 700 feet on your altimeter. Once you've rolled out on final, extend your flaps to 30 degrees, pitch for 60 knots of indicated airspeed, again trimming as needed to hold the pitch to hold the speed. Adjust power to stay on the glide slope. Again, the glide slopes in Flight Simulator, the visual ones anyway, seem to be a little shallower than they should be. So if you're a little bit high on the glide slope, I won't deduct any points. Just make sure that you have your aiming point at that aiming point marker at about 1,000 feet down the runway and try to touch down plus or minus 500 feet from there. Once you've done all that, accomplish a before landing checklist to make sure everything's set up how it should be for the landing, and then you'll just perform a normal landing like we did in the last lesson. Alright, so let's talk about how to set up for the flight. It will be pretty much the same exact setup as we did for the first lesson when we did takeoffs and level flight, turns, climbs, and descents. So we'll select the aircraft and make sure that we do have the 152 for weight and balance. We want to give ourselves two full tanks of gas and two 170-pound passengers, and that does it for the aircraft. For the airport, we want to select Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot. So Pine Bluff Regional Airport, Grider Field. And we do want to select runway 18, and that will put us on the runway ready for takeoff in Pine Bluff. And then for the flight conditions, we want clear skies. I've got a June day, 22nd of June, selected for lighting conditions. And then we'll make it about noon on that day, and that gives us probably the most favorable light. Then the temperature will set to 25 degrees Celsius, which is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Pressure is standard, which is 1013.25 millibars, which is 2992 on the altimeter. And then I will delete the wind layer so that we don't have a crosswind or any sort of wind messing with our landing. It seems like when you spawn the flight, though, it will still have the wind in there, so you have to go back in there and delete that again. But that should set us up for a good traffic pattern, so we can go ahead and start the flight now. Okay, for those last minute flight setup items, like I said, it for some reason regenerates the wind layer here, and as you can see, it gives you a little bit of a crosswind here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that wind layer so that we have calm winds for our initial landing practices. And then the other thing that I've done is that I've set up a custom camera. I set that up to custom camera 3, and it is just looking basically straight out the window to the left. Since we are doing a left traffic pattern here in Pine Bluff. And the only time I'm going to use this is initially when I get set up on the downwind, just to kind of take a look and see my position on the downwind. And then I'm also going to look when I am abeam the approach end of the runway or beam the numbers to know when it's time to start setting up for the approach. And giving that quick custom cam gives you a quick look over to the left wing, and then you can reset it back to your flight instruments. If you use the quick view, the problem with that is it does a nice quick view to the left, but then it slams you back into an odd position. It's a little higher from where you've got your custom camera set. So I just use that custom camera to switch between those two views. All right, before we get rolling here, we want to do our before takeoff checklist. So the parking brake is released, the lights are on. Elevator trim is set for takeoff. Carb heat is cold. Mixture is full rich. Flaps are 10 and the transponder is on alt. We are ready to go flying. This will be a normal takeoff, so advance the power to full throttle. Then control my nose wheel steering with the yaw control. Try to keep it on the center line. Airspeed's alive. 50 knots, will rotate, pitch up to about 10 degrees. Airplane's airborne. Hold that 10 degrees and trim for that 10 degrees. All right, 60 knots, so we'll go ahead and retract our flaps. The nose is going to want to pitch down a little bit. We're just going to make small corrections on the departure leg with our roll to keep our heading about 180. You can also take the quick view camera behind you and make sure you're supposed to maintain the extended runway center line, but as long as you're on that heading of about 180 with no wind, you should maintain that runway center line. Next thing we're looking for is 700 feet. There's 700 feet, so we'll go ahead and start about a 20 degree bank turn to enter that downwind, or excuse me, enter the crosswind. Continue to climb, still pitching for 70 knots. Up to 25 degrees is fine, and those property lines out there will actually help you roll out on that easterly heading. Hold that pitch, make small corrections to keep on your easterly heading. Next thing we're looking for is 1,200 feet, traffic pattern altitude. That's where we'll level off and then turn our downwind. Just like normal, we'll lead the level off by about 10% of our rate of climb, so 70 feet. Start pitching down. Allow the airplane to accelerate. And once it gets to about 95 knots, we can go ahead and pull that power back. And then it's time to turn our downwind. So again, about a 20 degree bank turn should be just fine. Maintain your pitch, and I got the power a little low here, and we'll roll out on a northbound heading. You'll notice as we roll out, there's that industrial area up to the north, just south of the river, and our nose should be pretty much pointed right at that. Once we level off, we'll perform an after takeoff checklist. So we're going to leave our lights on. So lights is required on this checklist. Leave those on, and then flaps are up. The after takeoff checklist is complete. And another way to judge our position on the pattern is take a look out that left wing, and you can see the runway is cutting through the top third of my strut. That green kind of tinted road there is cutting through the bottom third of the strut, and so that means we're in a good position on downwind. Again, in real life, you wouldn't want to fly the pattern quite this wide. You want to give it a little more, make it a little more tight to the runway, but in Flight Simulator, this is going to work out just fine. Okay, so I am approaching the end of the runway here. I'm abeam the threshold or abeam the numbers, so let's go ahead and start setting up for the approach. I'll go ahead and bring the carburetor heat on, reduce the power to about 1900 RPMs, and then I'm going to hold the altitude with the pitch and trim to maintain that pitch and allow the aircraft to slow. Once I hit 85 knots, go ahead and bring that first notch of flaps out. Now I'm going to pitch for about 80 knots of speed and adjust the power to do about a 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. We just crossed over the road, so I'm going to go ahead and make my base turn. About a 20-degree bank turn, 20 to 25 degrees bank turn should work out well for the base leg. Got to watch that pitch in the turn. It does want to drop the nose a little bit and accelerate just a little bit. So you can see the road. I'm flying parallel to that road. I can see that grove of trees where I want to turn final ahead. I'm going to go ahead and bring the flaps to 70 degrees. Try to hold my pitch about where it was, and that should let me slow to about 70 knots, and I'll trim it as needed. And then we'll turn our final right as those trees kind of cross underneath our nose there. You can see those tree, that clump of trees is just slightly left of my nose here. And again, adjusting the power to maintain that 70 knots and about 400 to 500 feet per minute on the descent. You can see that green area off to the left of the nose, just south of the road. That's where I want to turn and position myself. If I line up with that, I should be pretty well lined up with the runway here at Pine Bluff. So we'll make a slow turn to final here. There's our approach lights, so I'll kind of line up with those. As I get rolled out on final, I'll go ahead and bring in that last notch of flaps. And then I'll pitch for about 60 knots. A little bit high, so I'm going to adjust my power. Get my aiming points about the 1,000 foot mark, so that's okay. I'll run through a quick before landing checklist. The landing taxi lights are on. The carb heat's on, the mixture is full rich, and the flaps are 30. So the before landing checklist is complete. And now I'm just going to perform a normal landing. Coming over the threshold, pull the power to idle, smart my round out, and then flare. Get it up to about 5 degrees of pitch. Touch down on those main wheels, and then bring the nose gear down. So that is a normal traffic pattern, and as you can see, things happen just a little bit quicker in the traffic pattern than they do in the other maneuvers that we've practiced.
So when you're in the pattern performing practice landings, you don't have to do a full stop landing where you bring the aircraft to a stop and taxi off the runway every time. You have the option of doing actually about 4 different things, and those are a low pass or a low approach. A low pass is basically where you fly the approach down to about 100 feet or so above the runway, then you add power to fly at approach speed, or you can reconfigure and fly at a faster speed if you're trying to impress people. Twin pilots do that all the time. And then towards the end of the runway, you go ahead and initiate a go-around. A low approach is very similar in that you fly the approach down to, again, about 100 feet or so above the runway, and then execute a go-around from the approach end of the runway rather than the departure end of the runway. You see pilots that are practicing instrument approaches do this all the time. They don't want to take the time to do a landing because they're pretty proficient at landings at that point. They need to get up and practice more instrument approaches. So they'll fly the approach to the point where they could see the runway in instrument conditions, and then they'll perform the missed approach or the go-around. You can also do a full stop landing, which again is where you come to a stop and taxi off the runway, and usually either taxi to the parking area or taxi back around for another takeoff. You can also do a stop and go landing, which is where you do a normal landing, and then you stop the airplane on the runway, and then as you're stopped, you reconfigure, put your flaps up, and then the 152, you put the carb heat back in, and then you perform another takeoff. And the final option is the touch and go, which this is where you perform a normal landing, and then once your nose wheel goes down, you reconfigure and apply power while you're still rolling and perform another takeoff. When you're at a towered airport in the real world, the tower may state that you're cleared for the option, which means you may choose to perform any of the above at your discretion. In Flight Simulator, though, you're going to be cleared for what you requested, either a full stop or a touch and go. They don't have the option for a stop and go or a low pass. So they will clear you for what you requested, full stop or touch and go on the downwind leg. And once you get past the downwind leg and they've given you that clearance, you can't even request anything different. You can do whatever you want, and I haven't heard Tower complain about it if you do something they didn't clear you to do. But that's the logic in Flight Simulator is once you're past that downwind clearance, you can't ask ATC for anything different. We've already covered full stop landings. Just get your aircraft down to a reasonable taxi speed, exit the runway, and perform the after landing checklists. Then you can either taxi to the parking area or back around for another takeoff. I'll cover low passes when we get into crosswind landings, and a low approach is basically just a go around, so we've already covered that as well. If you're going to do a stop and go or a touch and go, before you perform that, you want to make sure that you have enough runway left to get safely airborne again. On paper, the 152 needs less than 1,000 feet to get airborne from a dead stop, so if you give yourself 2,000 feet or so, you should be fine. I'd recommend using the third taxiway from the end of the runway at Pine Bluff as kind of a no-go point. As you can see, it looks like it's about 1,000 feet from the 1,000-foot aiming point marker for runway 36. So if you're at that point prior to applying the power for a takeoff on a touch and go or a stop and go, you should be fine. So let's talk through the procedure for a stop and go. So the procedure for a stop and go landing is pretty straightforward. It's basically doing a normal landing, coming to a stop, and then reconfiguring and doing a normal takeoff. So come to a full stop on the runway using your brakes, and it's okay to hold the brakes while you're sitting on the runway so you don't roll down the runway and lose runway as you're reconfiguring. Again, make sure that you have at least 2,000 feet of runway remaining. We talked about Pine Bluff at that third taxiway being kind of our no-go point. If you're past that, it's best to just taxi off the runway or back taxi on the runway and get yourself a little more room. Then we'll want to reconfigure for takeoff, so push the carb heat off, retract the flaps to 10 degrees, and at that point you're ready for takeoff. So release your brakes and smoothly apply takeoff power and perform a normal takeoff. And you can either depart the pattern or you can stay in the pattern, whichever you prefer to do. All right, so let's talk about the touch and go procedure for the 152. You just want to perform a normal landing on the mains first and then bringing the nose wheel down. After the nose wheel touches down, you want to do your reconfiguration on the roll. So push your carb heat in and retract your flaps to 10 degrees. And after you've reconfigured, go ahead and smoothly apply full power. And it should go without saying that while you're doing this, you are maintaining directional control and maintaining that center line with your yaw control. At 50 knots, go ahead and rotate just like you would in a normal takeoff to that 10 degrees of pitch and allow the aircraft to fly off the runway. It's possible if you configure quickly and get that power back in quickly, you could be above 50 knots once you've got all that done. So if you're above 50 knots, just go ahead and rotate at whatever speed you're at. Rotate to that 10 degrees of pitch and then perform your normal takeoff procedures you normally would. As you're accelerating through 60 knots, it becomes basically a normal takeoff after this point. So you're going to retract your flaps to 0, pitch for 70 knots, and again trim to maintain that 70 knots. And then you can either continue the normal traffic pattern procedures, turning your crosswind at 500 feet above the field, or you can depart the area and as you're climbing through 1,000 feet, get your lights off and run your after takeoff checklist. One little caveat about touch and goes and stop and goes is it does not appear that Flight Simulator recognizes those as landings. It's good for getting the practice in, but if you're trying to fill landings out in The logbook in Flight Simulator, just know that apparently it does not log those as landings. You have to actually do a full stop and I guess taxi off the runway. I'm not sure what the logic is exactly, that what it counts as a landing and what it doesn't, but apparently touch and goes and stop and goes don't count.
Alright, so let's take a look at a touch and go landing. I am on short final here, about 200 feet above the field, and we'll do a normal landing into a touch and go. So the before landing checklist is complete. I'm just going to do a normal landing and then transition to the touch and go. Just like when they do their normal landing, as I come over the threshold here, I'm going to pull my power to idle. Hold the pitch until I get down to about 50 feet, then I'll do that round out. And I will do the flare. Get that 5 degrees in there. Main wheels are down. Nose wheels down. Go ahead and push in the carb heat. Bring the flaps up to 10 degrees and apply full power. And we're below 50, so we'll wait for 50 to rotate. And it basically becomes a normal takeoff. Pitch for about 10 degrees to get it airborne. As we accelerate through 60 degrees, we'll go ahead and retract the flaps. At that point, we're back to our normal traffic pattern procedures. I'm trimming to maintain 70, accelerating to 70, and then maintain that. I get to 500 feet above the field, or about 700 feet on the altimeter. Then I will turn my crosswind leg. So that is a touch and go.
So let's talk about entering the traffic pattern area if you're coming in from another location. There is a recommended way to enter the traffic pattern to ensure you can enter the flow of traffic smoothly and see any other traffic that might be at the field. Now, I'm not going to tell you that all pilots use these procedures in the real world, especially 100% of the time, but they are what is recommended as best practices and most likely what an examiner would want to see you do on a check ride. In Flight Simulator, it's up to you whether you want to do these procedures or not, just depending on how realistic you want to make your flying. Again, they're best practices, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with performing a long, straight-in approach to an airport if you don't have any of the traffic turned on in the sim. If you're entering the traffic pattern from the same side as the downwind leg, you'll want to maneuver to enter the pattern at a 45-degree angle to the downwind at about midfield. If you're approaching the pattern from any other direction, you want to maneuver to fly over midfield, or about the middle of the runway, perpendicular to the runway, at 500 to 1,000 feet above traffic pattern altitude. You can use 500 feet if there are unlikely to be any jets in the pattern, but you should use 1,000 feet at fields where jets frequent the pattern, as 1,500 feet above the airport is their pattern altitude. You'll want to fly beyond the downwind leg, then begin a 225-degree descending turn in the opposite direction of the pattern to set up for that 45-degree entry into the downwind at midfield at traffic pattern altitude. If the airport doesn't have much traffic, it's also acceptable to fly over midfield above traffic pattern altitude, then make a descending left-hand turn directly into the downwind leg. So let's take a look at our proficiency standards for flying the traffic pattern. This is going to look a lot like our proficiency standards for other maneuvers. We want to be able to maintain our airspeed plus or minus 10 knots in our level segments in the pattern. We want to be able to maintain our airspeed plus 10 minus 5 knots in the climb segments and the approach segments. We want to be able to maintain our traffic pattern altitude plus or minus 100 feet. And we want to be able to maintain proper orientation and ground track in the pattern. We want to be able to fly all those legs in the pattern appropriately and appropriate distance from the airport. The standards for the takeoffs and landings are unchanged from what we discussed in the maneuvers the first time we did those maneuvers. So if you have any questions about those standards, go.
So that concludes our lesson on traffic patterns. In the next couple of lessons, we will take a look at navigation. So we'll get away from the airport and start learning how to get from point A to point B. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.